All right, imagine you wake up tomorrow and someone asks you how old you are and you have no idea. No birth certificate, no calendar app buzzing with a countdown to your birthday, no cake with candles you have to blow out before your smoke detector starts screaming. Just you, standing in a field somewhere 50,000 years ago, trying to figure out if you're old enough to hunt a mammoth or young enough that someone should still be cutting your food for you. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, buckle up, because that was just Tuesday for most of human history. We are obsessed with age today. It's on our driver's license, our dating profiles, our resumes, our gravestones eventually. We measure ourselves against invisible lines drawn by a calendar system that didn't even exist for most of the time humans have walked this planet. So, how on earth did ancient people who had no concept of the number 2026, figure out how old they were? Spoiler alert, they mostly didn't. Not in the way you're thinking. And the way they actually did it is honestly a lot more fascinating, a little bit terrifying, and occasionally kind of hilarious. So let's start at the very beginning, because to understand how ancient humans tracked age, you first have to understand something uncomfortable. For the vast majority of our species' existence, nobody was counting birthdays. There was no birthday. There was no year one. There was no happy 25th, here's a card with a cartoon dog on it. Early humans measured time the way you'd measure how long you've been friends with someone whose exact meeting date you forgot years ago. Vaguely, through vibes, through big, unmistakable events. Think about it this way. If you lived in a small hunter-gatherer band 40,000 years ago, your understanding of your own age would have been tied almost entirely to your body and your role in the group. You weren't 9 years old. You were the one who just started coming on hunts, or the one who can carry water now without spilling half of it. Age wasn't a number. Age was a job description. And honestly, there's something kind of freeing about that until you remember there was no retirement plan, and the job description eventually became the one everyone worries about when winter comes. Now, before you picture ancient humans as some kind of confused toddlers wandering around going, how old am I? Truly, let's give them some credit, because they were absolutely tracking time, just not the way we do. The earliest evidence we have of humans keeping track of anything resembling a calendar comes from bones. Actual bones with actual notches carved into them, and this is where things get cool. There's an object called the Labombo bone, found in a cave in the mountains between South Africa and Swaziland, and it's got 29 distinct notches carved into it. 29. Does that number ring a bell? It's suspiciously close to the number of days in a lunar cycle, which is about 29 and a half days. This bone is estimated to be around 43,000 years old, which is an absolutely wild amount of time for someone to have looked up at the moon, gone through its full cycle, and thought, yeah, I should probably write this down. Except, of course, there was no paper, so they used a baboon's fibula, as you do. Then there's the Ishango bone, discovered near the headwaters of the Nile, which has a similarly notched pattern that some researchers believe could represent a 6-month lunar calendar. Now, archaeologists argue about exactly what these notches mean because that's what archaeologists do best. They argue about bones in academic journals while the rest of us just want a straight answer. But the leading theory is that these were early attempts to track cycles of time, probably tied to the moon, possibly tied to menstrual cycles, possibly used for basic counting or trade. Either way, what this tells us is that even tens of thousands of years ago, humans had this deep, almost compulsive urge to mark time somehow. We just couldn't help ourselves. But here's the important distinction, and this is where it gets interesting for our specific question about personal age. Tracking the moon tells you how much time has passed collectively. It does not tell an individual human, you are now this many moons old. That's a completely different mental leap. For that, you need something more personal, something tied to your own body and your own life. And that's exactly what most ancient societies actually used. So let's talk about the real answer to how ancient humans tracked their age, because it wasn't candles on a cake. It was their bodies. It was milestones. It was essentially biology doing the counting for them. Think about the most obvious age markers your own body gives you without any math involved. Baby teeth falling out. That happens in a pretty predictable window, somewhere between 5 and 7 years old. Ancient humans absolutely noticed this. A kid with a gap where their front tooth used to be was recognizably in a certain life stage, whether or not anyone knew the exact number attached to it. Then puberty hits, and suddenly there's a very obvious, very unmissable signal that a person has crossed into a new category of humanity. Voices change, bodies change, and in many ancient cultures, this transition wasn't just noticed, it was celebrated, ritualized, sometimes turned into an enormous, elaborate ceremony that the whole community organized around. This is actually one of the coolest parts of ancient age tracking: rites of passage. Instead of a number, you got an event. A moment where your community collectively agreed, all right, this person is now an adult, or this person can now marry, or this person can now go on the hunt with the rest of us instead of staying back with the children. These ceremonies existed across basically every ancient culture we know of, from indigenous groups in Africa and the Americas to early societies in Europe and Asia. The specific rituals varied wildly, sometimes involving physical trials, sometimes involving isolation periods, sometimes involving body modification, but the underlying concept was strikingly consistent. Age wasn't a number you counted to. Age was a threshold you crossed, publicly, in front of witnesses. And honestly, when you think about it, this system had some real advantages over ours. Nobody was having an identity crisis over turning 30. There was no anxiety spiral about being behind where you should be in life, because there was no universal number everyone was measuring themselves against. You just moved through recognized stages at whatever pace your body and your community decided, and everyone understood exactly where you stood based on what you looked like and what responsibilities you held. Now, let's get into the seasonal side of things, because this is honestly one of my favorite parts. Agricultural societies, once farming became a thing roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, needed to track time far more precisely than hunter-gatherers did. You can't just vaguely wander through the year if your entire food supply depends on planting seeds at the correct moment and harvesting before the frost kills everything. This is where we start seeing the birth of actual structured calendars, and with them, a slightly more numerical concept of age starts creeping in. The ancient Egyptians developed one of the earliest solar calendars, based on the annual flooding of the Nile, which was so reliable and so central to their entire civilization that they essentially built their sense of time around it. Their year had 3 seasons tied directly to the agricultural cycle: flooding, growing, and harvesting. If you were Egyptian and someone asked how old you were, there's a decent chance the answer involved counting Nile floods rather than counting years in the abstract sense we use today. Imagine explaining your age to someone by saying, I have survived this river overflowing 22 times. There's a poetry to that which I'm 22 just doesn't capture. The Babylonians, meanwhile, were busy developing one of the most mathematically sophisticated calendar systems of the ancient world, a lunisolar calendar that tracked both the moon's cycles and the solar year, occasionally throwing in an extra month to keep everything aligned. Kind of like an ancient leap year, but way more complicated and way more argued about by priests. And here's the thing: once you have a formalized calendar like this, tracking someone's exact age in years becomes much more feasible, at least for people whose birth was considered important enough to record. Which, let's be honest, usually meant royalty, priests, or the extremely wealthy. If you were a regular farmer, chances are nobody was writing down the exact day you were born. You just existed, aged, and were generally categorized as young, grown, or old, based on how you looked and what you could physically do. This brings up something really important that a lot of people don't realize: precise, individual age tracking. The kind where you know your exact birthday and can state your age in a specific number of years is actually a relatively late development in human history. And for most of that history, it was a privilege, not a universal practice. Ancient Rome is a great example of this. Roman citizens absolutely used a calendar system, and important events like births of nobility or emperors were recorded with real precision. But for the average Roman citizen, age was often approximated. Roman census records sometimes show people rounding their ages to suspiciously convenient numbers, ages ending in 0 or 5, showing up far more often than statistics would predict. This is a phenomenon historians and demographers call age heaping, and it happens because when people don't actually know their precise age, they tend to round to numbers that feel significant or are easy to remember. It's the ancient equivalent of someone asking how old you are and you going, around 30. Except in their case, it wasn't an approximation of something they could look up, it was the most accurate answer they had. Now, here's where things get fascinating, because there's a whole other side to this question we haven't touched on yet. How do we today figure out how old ancient humans were when they died, given that they weren't exactly carrying identification cards? This is where forensic anthropology and archaeology step in, and honestly, this part is almost more interesting than how ancient people tracked their own age because it involves reading the human skeleton like a diary written in calcium. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. When archaeologists find ancient human remains, one of the very first things they try to determine is age at death. And they do this primarily by examining bones and teeth, because both of these structures change in remarkably predictable ways as we grow in age. Teeth, for instance, are incredible biological clocks. Baby teeth erupt and are eventually replaced by permanent teeth in a well-documented sequence. So if archaeologists find the remains of a child, they can often pinpoint the age within a very narrow range just by looking at which teeth have come in and which haven't. Even in adults, teeth continue to provide clues through wear patterns. Ancient diets were rough. Grain-based diets, especially ones involving stone-ground flour, meant tiny particles of grit ended up in the bread, and that grit slowly ground down tooth enamel over a lifetime. So heavily worn molars can actually help estimate roughly how many decades a person had been chewing their way through gritty ancient bread. Bones themselves also tell a story. Long bones like the femur have growth plates that fuse at different, well-documented ages. So an unfused growth plate in a skeleton immediately tells researchers that person died before a certain age, often before their early 20s. Even after growth plates fuse, bones continue to subtly change throughout adulthood. The pelvis in particular undergoes gradual and fairly predictable changes as people age, and forensic anthropologists have developed detailed scoring systems based on these changes that let them estimate age at death within a reasonably tight range, especially for younger and middle-aged adults. It gets a bit fuzzier for elderly remains because the body's aging process slows down its own rate of obvious change, which is either annoying for scientists or a small mercy for the ancient elderly, depending on how you look at it. There's also a wilder, more modern technique involving something called aspartic acid racemization, which sounds like a spell from a fantasy novel but is actually a real chemistry-based dating method. Essentially, certain amino acids in your tooth enamel slowly change their molecular structure over your lifetime at an extremely predictable rate. And by measuring this change, scientists can estimate age at death with impressive precision, sometimes down to just a couple of years. So, in a strange, beautiful twist, modern science can now determine an ancient person's age far more precisely than that person themselves probably ever could during their own lifetime. There's something almost poetic about that. Someone who never knew their own exact age is now, thousands of years later, having it calculated down to a level of precision they could never have imagined. Okay, but let's swing back to something we touched on earlier, because I think it deserves more attention. The role of oral tradition and storytelling in tracking age and generational time. In cultures without written records, elders often served as the living memory of the community, and part of that role involved keeping track of major events, lineages, and generational shifts. Someone's age might be measured relative to a significant event. She was born the winter the Great Drought hit, or he was already a grown man when the volcano erupted. This might sound imprecise to us, but within these communities, it was actually a remarkably functional system because everyone shared the same reference points. If you know a major flood happened a certain number of harvests ago, and you know a particular child was born the same season, you can reconstruct a fairly accurate relative age without ever touching a number. This kind of event-based age tracking shows up all over the world in indigenous cultures, and honestly, some communities still use forms of it today alongside modern calendars. It's a reminder that our obsession with exact numerical age is really more of a cultural choice than some universal human necessity. Plenty of thriving, sophisticated societies functioned perfectly well using relative and event-based systems instead. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. The ancient Chinese had one of the more mathematically interesting approaches to age, and parts of this tradition actually survive today. Traditionally, in Chinese culture, a person is considered 1 year old at birth, not zero, and then gains another year not on their personal birthday, but collectively at the Lunar New Year when everyone ages up together. This system, sometimes called nominal age, meant your age wasn't really about your individual timeline at all. It was tied to the community's shared calendar. Everyone leveled up together like some kind of ancient, unavoidable group birthday party that happened whether you wanted it or not. This actually connects to something deeper about how many ancient cultures viewed age. It wasn't purely an individual attribute, it was often a communal one, tied to shared cycles, shared harvests, shared seasonal events. Your age was your relationship to the group's timeline as much as it was a measure of your own personal existence. Let's also talk briefly about ancient Greece, because they had their own fascinating quirks. Greek city-states didn't all use the same calendar, which honestly sounds like an absolute administrative headache, and years were often identified not by a number but by whoever held a particular political office that year, like an archon in Athens. So if you wanted to know how old someone was, you might end up in a conversation that involved cross-referencing which archon was in charge when they were born versus which archon was currently in charge, which is a wonderfully chaotic way to figure out you're turning 27. The Olympics actually became one of the more unifying timekeeping devices across the Greek world, since the games happened every 4 years and were widely recognized, giving people a shared 4-year unit they could count events, and by extension ages, against. Now here's a fun tangent worth sitting with for a second. The concept of a birthday, as we know it, an annual personal celebration of the exact date you were born, wasn't really a common practice for most people throughout ancient history. Birthdays were often reserved for the powerful. Pharaohs, kings, and emperors had their birthdays recorded, and sometimes celebrated, partly because their birth was considered politically or religiously significant, and partly because, frankly, someone was paying scribes to write this stuff down. The average person, the farmer, the laborer, the fisherman, generally did not have their exact birth date recorded anywhere, which means for the overwhelming majority of humans who have ever lived, an exact, celebrated annual birthday simply wasn't part of their life experience. Wrap your head around that for a second. Somewhere out there, someone right now is stressed about turning 30, and for most of human history, that stress literally could not have existed because the concept it's built on wasn't accessible to regular people. So why did we eventually shift toward this obsession with precise, individual, annually tracked age? A big part of the answer comes down to record-keeping systems tied to religion, taxation, and legal status. As societies grew larger and more complex, governments needed ways to track who owed taxes, who was eligible for military service, who could legally marry, and who could inherit property. All of these practical, bureaucratic needs required something more precise than, "he's basically a grown man now, probably." Ancient Rome, for example, conducted regular censuses partly to determine tax obligations and military eligibility, and this pushed toward more formalized age tracking, at least for citizens whose status mattered legally. Religious institutions also played a massive role in formalizing personal age records. As organized religion spread, and church record-keeping became more standardized, particularly in medieval Europe, baptismal records started to function as informal birth certificates. If a church recorded the exact date you were baptized, which usually happened shortly after birth, that record effectively became a reliable marker of your age, at least within that religious and administrative system. This is actually one of the more direct threads connecting ancient vague age tracking to our modern precise birth certificate system. Let's pause here for a second, because I want to bring this back to something almost philosophical, because I think it's worth thinking about. The way ancient humans tracked age reveals something about how they understood their place in the world. When your age is tied to seasons, to harvests, to communal rituals, to your physical capabilities rather than an abstract number, your entire relationship with time and identity looks fundamentally different than ours does today. You're not counting down to some arbitrary milestone. You're moving through recognized stages of life alongside your community, marked by what you can do and what you've experienced rather than a number written on a piece of paper. There's something almost enviable about that, honestly, even though I would absolutely not trade modern dentistry and antibiotics to go live it out personally. But there's a lesson buried in here about how much of what we consider fundamental about identity, like knowing your exact age down to the day, is actually a fairly recent cultural construct built on top of bureaucratic necessity and religious record keeping rather than some universal human truth. Let's circle back one more time to the biological side, because there's a detail I skipped that's honestly one of the most clever ancient age tracking methods out there. Tracking age through hair and gray hair patterns, wrinkle development, and general physical deterioration, which sounds obvious, almost insultingly simple, but it was one of the primary ways ancient communities categorized people into broad age groups. Many ancient legal and social systems divided people into life stages like childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age with different rights, responsibilities, and expectations attached to each category, and the transition between these categories was often judged visually and physically rather than numerically. Elders were respected specifically because their visible signs of aging represented accumulated experience and survival, which in societies without written records made them walking libraries of practical knowledge, agricultural wisdom, and tribal history. Their age wasn't a number to be calculated. It was a visible, respected achievement. Now let's talk about something that ties this whole thing together in a way that I think is genuinely mind-blowing. The average life expectancy in many ancient societies was significantly lower than it is today, largely due to high infant and childhood mortality rates dragging the average down. But here's the twist that a lot of people misunderstand. This doesn't mean ancient people who survived childhood typically dropped dead at 30. If you made it through the dangerous early years and through the various diseases, infections, and accidents that could take a person out at any point, it was genuinely common to live into your 50s, 60s, or even beyond in many ancient societies. The low average life expectancy numbers you often hear thrown around are heavily skewed by how brutal childhood mortality was, not because adult humans were dropping dead constantly at what we'd now consider a young age. This matters for our topic because it means the elderly, the wise grandparents and community leaders whose visible age markers commanded respect, were a real and present part of ancient society, not some rare anomaly. So, when we ask how ancient humans tracked their age, the real answer is layered and honestly kind of beautiful once you piece it all together. It wasn't one single method. It was biology combined with community memory, combined with seasonal cycles, combined with, eventually, increasingly formalized calendars driven by religious and political necessity. It was baby teeth falling out, and voices cracking, and gray hairs appearing, and harvests being counted, and rivers flooding on schedule, and moons waxing and waning, while someone carved a notch into a bone just to keep some kind of record, some proof that time was passing and they were noticing it happen. And when you really sit with that, it kind of reframes how you think about your own relationship with age today. We've built this incredibly precise system: birth certificates, calendars synced to atomic clocks, apps that remind us of birthdays weeks in advance, and yet the underlying human experience of aging, the milestones, the transitions, the way your body and your role in your community change over time, that hasn't actually changed all that much from the earliest humans carving notches into a baboon's leg bone 43,000 years ago. We're all still just trying to keep track of time passing, one way or another, and honestly, whether you're counting candles on a cake or counting how many times the Nile has flooded, the impulse is exactly the same. If you made it this far, you now know more about ancient timekeeping and age tracking than approximately 99% of the population, which is either a delightful party fact or a slightly concerning sign about how you're spending your evening, and either way, I respect it completely.